For millions around the world, Stephen Hawking brought the heavens down to Earth. As much pop culture icon as astrophysicist, showing off his wicked sense of humor on the Big Bang Theory.
Stephen Hawking's wife finally speaks out. We all admired Stephen Hawking, the brilliant mind behind groundbreaking theories and one of the most recognizable voices in science. But what if the woman by his side has been hiding untold stories for years?
Professor Hawking, it's an honor and a privilege to meet you, sir.
The most famous scientist since Einstein, proving the mind can triumph over the body's greatest challenges. Hawking was diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease.
Those stories are filled with passion, conflict, and profound impact. So what really happened behind closed doors with his second wife? How did Stephen manage to maintain his scientific brilliance amidst such personal turmoil? And why did his wife call herself his slave for 20 years? And did she really try to psychically abuse Stephen? The answers to these questions will change everything you thought you knew about this iconic figure. Born intellectual. Stephen Hawking was born on a winter day in 1942, right in the middle of World War II. Stephen's parents, Frank and Isabel Hawking, were both super smart. Frank, born in 1905, was a medical researcher, a scientist studying diseases. He had gone to Oxford and then worked in Africa. Isabel, born in 1915, was a secretary who had also gone to Oxford in the 1930s. That was a rare thing for women back then. But the Great Depression made things hard, and she had to leave school to help her family. Frank and Isabel loved to learn new things. They got married in 1937, and their home was filled with books and chats about science, politics, and all sorts of interesting things. They had 4 kids, and Stephen was the oldest. His sisters, Philippa and Mary, were a big part of his life. Philippa, born a year after Stephen, was really smart and close to him. Mary, born in 1947, loved art, adding a different flavor to the family. The Hawkings also adopted Edward, who was born in 1956. Stephen's childhood was filled with moving around because of the war and his dad's job. They first went to London, but soon went back to Oxford to be safe. Even with all the changes, the Hawkings made sure their home was a happy and interesting place. Money was tight, but their house was full of books, and the kids were always encouraged to ask questions and learn about the world. Stephen's dad had tons of science books, and he wanted Stephen to read them. This is how Stephen first got interested in science and math. They also had classic novels, which opened up Stephen's mind even more. Stephen's school days were a mix of regular classes and learning at home. His journey started at Byron House School, where he was full of questions and excitement about learning. But his schoolwork wasn't always easy for him at first. At Byron House, Stephen was known for being curious. The school liked kids to be creative and think on their own, which was great for Stephen. He loved science and figuring out how things worked, but his grades weren't anything special. For a while, Stephen went to St. Albans High School for girls. Back then, younger boys could go to girls' schools, and Stephen actually did well there. The school was tough, and they really cared about each student. This is where he started to get interested in math, even though he still had some trouble with schoolwork. Then Stephen went to Radlett School, and later to St. Albans School. At Radlett, he started to do better in class. The school was strict, and they focused a lot on science, which helped him a lot. St. Albans School was a fancy school, and this is where people started to notice how smart Stephen really was. Even though he loved science and math, Stephen had a hard time with the way they taught things at school. His grades weren't the best, and some people thought he was just an average student. But his teachers saw something in him. They knew he could understand complicated ideas. Back in the mid-1950s, computers weren't something everyone had. But Stephen and his buddies, Richard and Tony, decided to make their own. They spent hours in Richard's garage tinkering with old gadgets and trying things out. The computer they made was pretty basic, with switches and stuff that acted like a real computer. They had to learn about circuits and how to program all by themselves. This whole project made Stephen understand electronics way better, and made him even more interested in science. But Stephen wasn't just into gadgets. He loved playing board games like chess, where you have to think ahead and plan your moves. He was also crazy about building model airplanes. He would carefully put them together, making sure everything was just right. Then he'd fly them in the park, seeing how they worked and fixing them up if needed. Stephen's love for science really grew thanks to his math teacher, Mr. Tata. Mr. Tata made math fun and interesting. He wanted his students to really get it, not just memorize stuff. He was so excited about math that it made Stephen excited too. Mr. Tata saw how smart Stephen was and gave him extra help. He told Stephen he could solve tough problems and pushed him to do even more. Mr. Tata believed in Stephen so much that it made Stephen believe in himself, which is a big reason why he became a scientist. Learning from Bess. At 17, Stephen started studying at University College, Oxford. At first, it was a breeze for him. He was so smart that the classes didn't feel hard enough, and he got a little bored. He even admitted later that he wasn't doing his best work because he wasn't being pushed enough. But one person, his physics tutor Robert Berman, saw how much potential Stephen had. He helped Stephen get excited about physics again, especially the mysteries of the universe. This was a turning point for Stephen, making him more interested in this field. Even though Stephen was a super smart guy, he felt lonely and out of place at Oxford at first. Going from a small school to a big, famous university was hard. He was a bit shy, so it was tough to make friends. The fact that his classes weren't very challenging also made him feel stuck. To try and feel less lonely and be part of the university, Stephen joined the rowing team. He was small and quick-thinking, which made him a great coxswain. That's the person who sits at the back of the boat and tells everyone else what to do. Stephen was really good at it, showing how he could lead and think strategically. Joining the rowing team changed Stephen's social life for the better. He finally felt like he belonged somewhere and made some good friends. The team became like a second family, helping him not feel so alone. Rowing taught him about discipline and teamwork, which would help him later in his life. During his last year at Oxford, Stephen started to notice some strange things happening to his body. He became clumsier and would trip and fall more often. His hands and legs felt weak, and these problems just kept getting worse. He went to the doctor, but they weren't sure what was wrong at first. They thought maybe it was stress or working too hard. But in 1963, when Stephen was only 21, he got some really bad news. The doctors told him he had ALS, a disease that makes your muscles weaker and weaker over time. They did some tests, and the results confirmed it was ALS. This was a huge shock for Stephen and his family. The doctors said he probably only had about 2 years left to live. Can you imagine how scary that would be? As time went on, Stephen's body started to change. It got harder and harder for him to walk, and eventually, he needed a wheelchair. His speech also became harder to understand. All of this made life more difficult, but he found ways to keep going. He started using special equipment like a wheelchair designed just for him and later a machine that helped him speak. Even though his health was getting worse, Stephen didn't give up on his dream of being a scientist. In the fall of 1962, he went to Trinity Hall, a part of Cambridge University, to continue his studies. This was a big change for him. Cambridge was famous for its research on the universe and everything in it, so it was the perfect place for Stephen. He was fascinated by cosmology, which is the study of how the universe began and how it changes over time. It was like a puzzle he wanted to solve. At Cambridge, Stephen had a new mentor named Dennis Sayama, a famous physicist who knew a lot about space and time. At first, Stephen was a little bummed that he didn't get to work with another famous scientist named Fred Hoyle, but Dennis turned out to be a really great mentor for him. While studying at Cambridge, Stephen made some groundbreaking discoveries with the help of a mathematician named Roger Penrose. They worked on something called singularity theorems, which basically said that in certain situations, the universe has these super weird spots called singularities where space and time get all messed up. In 1966, Stephen finished his PhD. His dissertation was called Properties of Expanding Universes, and it was all about what singularities meant for the Big Bang Theory and our understanding of how gravity works. This work was the start of his incredible research on black holes and the secrets of the universe. Rise to stardom. In 1974, Stephen surprised everyone by saying that black holes aren't actually completely black. He said they give off a special kind of radiation, which we now call Hawking radiation. This was a game changer, because before, everyone thought nothing could escape the immense pull of a black hole. Stephen's discovery showed that even black holes aren't invincible and can eventually disappear over a very, very long time. His calculations showed how tiny particles near a black hole can act in a weird way, causing radiation to escape. This radiation makes the black hole slowly lose its mass. This was a huge breakthrough because it brought together two big ideas in physics that people thought couldn't work together: quantum mechanics and general relativity. At first, not everyone believed Stephen. It was a crazy idea that went against what scientists thought they knew. But over time, more and more scientists looked at his work and agreed with him. His theory became super important for understanding how gravity works in the quantum world. Stephen's work also led to something called the black hole information paradox, which is like a puzzle that scientists are still trying to solve. It's about what happens to information that falls into a black hole. This paradox has sparked a lot of debate and new research, which is really exciting for physicists. Sadly, Stephen's illness kept getting worse, and he eventually lost the ability to talk. In 1985, he got pneumonia, a serious lung infection that was very dangerous for someone with ALS. To save him, the doctors had to do a surgery called a tracheotomy. This helped him breathe, but it meant he couldn't speak anymore. But Stephen was not someone who gave up easily. He started using a special device that helped him talk. At first, it was a small clicker that he used to choose words from a screen. His friend Elaine Mason, who was a computer expert, made it for him. This way, Stephen could build sentences and speak using a computer voice. As Stephen's condition got worse, he couldn't use his hand as well, so he started using a muscle in his cheek to control the device. There was a tiny sensor on his glasses that would pick up his cheek movements and let him choose words on a screen. Over time, this technology got even better. Companies like Intel made special devices just for Stephen, with fancy features that made it easier for him to communicate. Even though the technology changed, Stephen kept his famous computer voice because it had become part of who he was. This speech-generating device was a lifeline for Stephen. It helped him keep doing the things he loved. He could still write papers, give talks, and have deep conversations about science, even though his body was failing him. Recognition worldwide. Stephen Hawking wasn't just a brilliant scientist, he was also a celebrated one. He received many awards and honors that showed how important his work was to the world of science and to people everywhere. In 2009, President Barack Obama gave Stephen the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest honor a civilian can get in the United States. It's like a big thank you for doing something amazing. This medal recognized Stephen's work in physics and cosmology, as well as his inspiring ability to overcome such a difficult illness. In 2006, Stephen received the Copley Medal from the Royal Society, a group of really smart scientists in the UK. This medal is the oldest science award in the world, and it's been given to some seriously famous people like Charles Darwin and Albert Einstein. Getting this medal put Stephen in the same league as those big names. Stephen also got lots of honorary degrees, which are like fancy awards from famous universities all over the world. Oxford, where he went to school, gave him one. So did Cambridge, where he worked as a professor. Even Harvard University in the US gave him one. He also got the Albert Einstein Award, a super special award for people who do amazing things in physics. And the Royal Astronomical Society gave him their top prize, the Gold Medal, for his work on black holes and the universe. Stephen was a member of many important scientific groups, which shows how respected he was. He was a Fellow of the Royal Society, a big deal for a British scientist. He was also a member of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, a group from the Vatican that's all about science. And in 1989, Queen Elizabeth II herself made Stephen a Companion of Honor, a special award for people who do great things in areas like science, art, or medicine. Then, in 1988, he got the Wolf Prize in Physics, one of the biggest awards you can get in this field. This prize was for his amazing work on black holes and the early universe. And in 2013, he won the Special Breakthrough Prize in Fundamental Physics, which was created by a businessman named Yuri Milner to celebrate huge advances in physics. Stephen wasn't just writing scientific papers that only other scientists could understand. He wrote books that made these complex ideas easy for anyone to grasp. His book, A Brief History of Time, published in 1988, sold more than 10 million copies around the world. It talks about big questions like space, time, the Big Bang, black holes, and even time travel. This book made him super famous and showed everyone how interesting science can be. He wrote other books too, like The Universe in a Nutshell, which went even deeper into things like supergravity and quantum theory. It had lots of cool pictures and easy-to-understand explanations. He even wrote a shorter version of his first book, and a book with a friend called The Grand Design, that talked about the newest ideas about how the universe was made. Stephen also appeared in documentaries and interviews. There was a TV show called Stephen Hawking's Universe that explained his ideas in a way that everyone could understand. He even had a show on the Discovery Channel called Into the Universe with Stephen Hawking, where he talked about things like aliens, time travel, and the Big Bang. These shows were filled with amazing pictures and Stephen's voice explaining everything. Stephen was a bit of a celebrity too. He appeared on The Simpsons and even Star Trek. There was a movie made about his life called The Theory of Everything, and the actor who played him, Eddie Redmayne, even won an Oscar. There were also documentaries about him that told his whole story, interviewing him, his family, and the people he worked with. Stephen Hawking wasn't just a scientist. He was a superstar who made science cool and interesting for everyone. Disturbed marriages. Even though Stephen was a brilliant mind, his personal life wasn't always easy. It was like a story with some dark twists and turns, especially when it came to love and marriage. In 1962, Stephen met Jane Wilde at a party. They fell in love and got engaged the next year, even though Stephen had just been diagnosed with a serious illness. He said that being with Jane gave him something to look forward to. They got married in their hometown of St. Albans in 1965. They lived in Cambridge, close to Stephen's work, and started a family. Jane finished her degree in London, and they even traveled to the United States a few times. They had 3 children, Robert, Lucy, and Timothy. But even though they looked like a happy family from the outside, things weren't always easy. In the late 1970s, Jane met someone named Jonathan Hellier Jones at church. They became friends, and eventually they developed feelings for each other. Jane said that Stephen knew about it and didn't mind as long as she still loved him. Jane and Jonathan didn't want to hurt anyone, so they kept their relationship platonic for a long time. By the 1980s, Stephen and Jane's marriage was struggling. Jane felt overwhelmed by all the nurses and helpers that Stephen needed. Plus, his fame was hard on their family and friends. They had to live up to this image of being a perfect couple, and it was a lot of pressure. Stephen and Jane also had different ideas about religion, which caused tension. Things got even harder when Stephen needed a tracheotomy in 1985. After the surgery, he needed a nurse all the time, and they had different nurses working in shifts. That's when Elaine Mason, a nurse with bright red hair and a lively personality, came into his life. She was married to David Mason, the guy who helped make Stephen's speech machine. Elaine knew all about the technology and was also a great nurse, which made her perfect for helping Stephen. From the start, Elaine treated Stephen differently. She talked to him like a real person, not just a patient. She was patient and could figure out what he needed even when he couldn't say it clearly. This created a special bond between them. Over time, Stephen and Elaine found out they liked a lot of the same things, like music and talking about new gadgets and scientific discoveries. They became more than just nurse and patient, they were friends. Soon, they were even more than friends. Elaine started to have strong feelings for Stephen, even though she was still married to David. Their connection grew even stronger, and they both found something special in each other. Elaine loved how smart and strong Stephen was, and Stephen loved how full of life Elaine was. She made his life more fun and exciting. As Stephen and Elaine got closer, it affected everyone around them, especially his kids and his first wife, Jane. Stephen's children, Robert, Lucy, and Timothy, had mixed feelings about Elaine. They were thankful for how well she took care of their dad, but they also didn't like how things were changing in the family. Their relationship with their dad was already complicated because of his illness, and now it was even more so. Jane, who had always been Stephen's biggest supporter, found this situation tough. She was still helping to take care of him, but it was clear that they weren't as close as they used to be. Elaine was filling that role now. Jane had her own relationship with Jonathan, but figuring out this new family situation was a real challenge. In 1990, Stephen told Jane that he was leaving her for Elaine. This was a huge change, and it was hard for everyone to adjust. In 1995, after divorcing Jane, Stephen and Elaine got married. It was a small wedding with just their close friends and family, but it was a big step for them. Stephen said, "It's wonderful. I have married the woman I love." But this new chapter in their lives would also bring its own set of challenges. Shocking revelations. People said that Elaine was physically abusive, that she had given Stephen a black eye and cut his lip. These accusations started popping up in the mid-90s, soon after they got married. The police looked into it a few times, and in 2000, they did a really big investigation. They talked to everyone they could think of, Stephen's nurses, his friends, his co-workers. But they couldn't find any real proof of abuse, so they had to close the case in 2004. There was even a scary story about Elaine letting Stephen slip underwater while giving him a bath, which was really dangerous because of his tracheotomy. But throughout all of this, Stephen stood by Elaine. He said the accusations weren't true and that she was taking great care of him. His assistant Judith also supported Elaine, saying the rumors were false and that they just had a very intense relationship that could be stormy at times. Elaine was going through her own struggles too. She felt like she was always in Stephen's shadow. He was so famous, and she felt like no one saw her as a person, just as his nurse. In a book written by one of Stephen's friends, Elaine even said she felt like a nothing and a nobody because of this. Sometimes Elaine's frustrations would bubble over. There was a story about her yelling at a dinner party, saying she had been Stephen's slave for years. This wasn't the only time she got upset in public. It showed how much pressure she was under. Taking care of Stephen was a really hard job, and it was taking a toll on Elaine's emotions. She often felt like no one appreciated her and that she was all alone with this huge responsibility. Sometimes she even admitted that she resented Stephen, even though she loved him. In 2006, Stephen and Elaine decided to get a divorce. It was a tough decision, but after years of trying to make things work, they realized it was time to move on. Elaine felt unseen and unhappy, and Stephen needed so much care that it was hard for them to have a normal relationship. They were both hurting, and they thought it was best to separate. They tried to keep things quiet and respectful during the divorce. Even though their relationship had been complicated, they wanted to end things in a peaceful way. The divorce changed a lot for both of them. Stephen had to find new people to help him, and Elaine had to figure out who she was without being Stephen's wife. They had both been in the spotlight because of their marriage, so this was a big adjustment for them. Final act. Stephen Hawking lived an extraordinary life, filled with incredible discoveries and personal challenges. But even the brightest stars eventually fade. On March 14, 2018, Stephen passed away peacefully at his home in Cambridge. He was 76 years old. The world mourned the loss of this brilliant mind and celebrated the incredible legacy he left behind. To honor his immense contributions to science, Stephen's ashes were placed in Westminster Abbey, a special place where only the most important people in British history are buried. His final resting place is between the graves of Sir Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin, two other science superstars. It's a symbolic way of showing how Stephen's work stands alongside the greatest scientific minds of all time. On June 15, 2018, a special memorial service was held at Westminster Abbey. Stephen's family, friends, and colleagues came together to celebrate his life and remember all he had achieved. People shared stories about his intelligence, his never-give-up attitude, and how he had changed the world of science and beyond. It was a fitting tribute to a man who had truly made his mark on history.